Welcome to the Why We Write Fantasy podcast, a podcast about all the reasons why we love to write and read fantasy, with your hosts, Oscar Ceceña and KJ Aiello.
Hello and welcome to the Why We Write Fantasy podcast. My name is Oscar and I'm joined by...
KJ Aiello, and I'm so excited to be here for our inaugural episode. So buckle in, people. No, not really. It's not going to be that wild, but it'll be fun, hopefully.
It'll be fun.
It'll
We're
be
going to
fun.
be talking about what are the things, why do we write fantasy? Why do we decide to make this podcast? Why do we love fantasy and all that? So
Yeah.
let's get ready.
All the writerly techniques, all the insider scoop, we've got it for you here. So, for our first episode, we decided to talk about why is it that we write and read fantasy and sci-fi and speculative fiction. Fantasy's been around for a long time, a couple hundred years now, actually. But everybody now has different reasoning behind why they love fantasy or why they love to write fantasy because it's so diverse now, the fantasy genre. So why don't we start, like, Oscar, tell me about your fantasy journey.
My fantasy journey is pretty... it goes a few decades.
Giving your age
Anyway,
away.
I'm just going to give you my age, but... So I started reading fantasy when I was a teenager. And I'm come from Mexico. I was born and raised there. And back in the 80s, I was born in 78. So people get an idea of what I'm talking about. So I started reading and I love reading. I started reading when I was a kid and I continue reading now. But when I was a teenager, it was in high school, like junior high school. I was 13 years old. And at school, they gave us the list of books that we had to read that year. And one of those books was The Hobbit. And at the time, I had no idea what it was about, but it was like, okay, I need to read it. That's fine. It was one of the ones that we had to read at the end of the it's called like the year. So I read it about maybe, I don't know, let's say May timeframe, and I loved it. I was so fascinated by this world, something that I had never seen before in my life. Like it was something completely magical, to the point that as a teenager, the first thing I did, my birthday is in May 26th, so I asked my mom to buy me the Lord of the Rings trilogy as a birthday gift. She gave it to me, and I read the three books. I didn't read that as fast as I do right now, but I think I read the three books in maybe a month or something like
That's
that, like a month and
amazing.
a half, like during the summer. And I think that's when it started. That was like the spark that just kindled this thing. And after that, I just kept reading. As I said, I wanted to mention that it was from Mexico and it was in the 80s because a lot of the authors that we now know, even from back then we used to know, they weren't translated to Spanish. So I had to find a different way to get into this. So I already knew a little bit of English, but I wasn't fluent on the language. So I just started getting the books that I could and started doing it. And that's when I found Dungeons and Dragons, which
Yeah.
became my favorite hobby for 30 years. So,
Yeah.
and that opened my fantasy spectrum to a completely different way. So yeah, that's kind of how my journey started.
That's
What
so
about you,
cool.
KG?
No,
Where did
no, we're
your...
gonna we're gonna stop on there. You said that opened my fantasy spectrum in a completely different way. I want you, like, I know the answer to this, but I really want you to touch on what did D&D and tabletop RPGs do for you then? That, going from The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings to D&D, what was different about it that really sparked you?
I think what I liked, and I still like, I love to be a game master,
Mm,
like building stories, building worlds. Honestly, most of the books that I buy that are from a TTRPG, either Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, whatever I buy, it's lore. What I get, like I get massive books about lore and the history of the world and how it was created, and what are the races that are there,
mm,
the gods, like what is there that makes this campaign setting so magical. And I think that's one of the things I loved about the Lord of the Rings, because after the Lord of the Rings, I went with the Silmarillion, like everything, like the
You
Fall of
went right
Numenor,
down that
like
rabbit hole.
everything that was Tolkien. I read it, and I started loving the like all the world building there.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
I think that's one of the reasons why I also love playing TTRPGs, because it allows me to create a world and play in the world and create as many stories as I want on a weekly basis. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's a pretty cool thing. Yeah.
Being there on a biweekly basis with you is it's pretty awesome. Oscar makes some pretty like epic campaigns where his motivation, I swear to God, is just to slaughter us all. Let's see how quick we can kill all the characters. This is Oscar. He's like the death game master. But anyways, he writes a pretty wicked campaign. I'm not gonna lie. I think my journey is it's similar to yours in a way. Obviously, I did not grow up in Mexico. I grew up in rural Ontario. Was fairly isolated. I grew up, and by rural, I mean for the first I think like 13 years of my life, I lived way out in the country. We had to get bused into school, and my neighbors were like a mile down the road, and I played in
Hmm.
forests and that sort of thing. Um, and I didn't start reading until a fairly late, I think. I was never a reader before, but my mom used to read Lord of the Rings to me. I remember being a little kid and lying on my mom's bed, and my mom was reading to me from this book. And it was, I know now as a grown up that was a really special edition of the Lord of the Rings. And we didn't have a lot of money. So this was one of the most expensive items in our house. And it was
Hmm.
all 3 books, and it was only about that thick, but it was on onion paper. So just the sound of the paper turning was just it was incredible. And the cover was just the door to Moria with the dwarfish runes, and and there was a tree, and then in the center of that was the even star. And it was just I just remember tracing my finger along that, and then just that first introduction to a magical world, and how excited my mother was about reading to me this magical book. I mean, I wasn't really that interested, but I think she needed it more than I did because again, we lived pretty isolated. um, she always tried to inculcate this sense of wonder and fantasy into me, which I really appreciate, and that's kind of become the template for my career now. um, but then it was a
Right.
little while. Yeah, it was a little while until I actually started reading on my own, and it was Dragonlance I picked up. And it was,
Hmm.
yeah, I think I was like 13 years old at that time. And I was not, again, there was more isolation in my life. I was not really a very popular kid in school. I was quite lonely. My mom was going through a really bad episode of depression. The recession hit us really hard. And then when I found these Dragonlance books, I mean, first of all, the covers were so colorful, and there was a dragon. I picked
Yeah.
up what is it, the War of the Lance, the trilogy, the War of the Lance, and each
Hmm.
cover of the first editions they had a different colored dragon. So it was a red dragon, there was a blue dragon, there was a green dragon, and then a wizard and a
Right.
kender and a dwarf. And I was like, what is this magic? I think it was the colors that drew me in first. But then I read the first one, and I read it in like 2 days. And I think my mom was
Yeah.
shocked because she was like, okay, is my daughter reading now? Like, what is happening? It just, and I didn't stop. And I became those worlds, that Kryn and the world in Dragonlance became my world. And it became
Yeah.
my solace, the place I could escape into when things around me were really, really difficult. And I wasn't, I mean, for a young kid, I was pretty depressed and pretty anxious. So I think it's in a way, um, like Dragonlance in a way kind of saved my sanity a little bit. And then from that I started writing my own fan fiction. And I didn't know what fan fiction was, but I still wrote it. And it was
But you wrote it.
really
Yeah.
bad. It
Yeah.
was a really I used words like burst and sunlight and shards and flames, and everything was like this female general and riding dragon. I mean, it was really cool, but I mean, how a
Yeah.
13, 14-year-old can write, it's not that great. But that was that spark never really died, even over the decades. And how things, life goes up and down. That spark never really died. And in my 30s, I started actually to return to the Dragonlance books that I had left behind 20 years ago.
Hmm.
And that pretty much was pivotal in my career. And I just said, I need to write. I need to write this. So that was
Yeah.
yeah, that's my adventure. A very short Coles Notes version of my adventures with fantasy. Yeah.
You know what I find interesting is that even though like we grew up like thousands of miles apart,
Yeah.
like it's kind of like the same around the same time. Like we're teenagers, like
Yeah.
13, and I think that's kind of when a lot of people start liking or discovering fantasy. And
Yeah.
this is not something that happened to us by accident, but it's also, I think it's a time where you're like developing your personality and all those things as
Yeah.
a teenager, and you need to find the things that resonate with you. Like there's many things. Like it doesn't have to be only one,
Yeah.
but the fact that you and I, we both picked this one randomly
Mhm.
out of so many things, and 30 years later, I mean, also giving out your age, I apologize,
Is
but
it I
it's
am
like,
a year
okay,
younger than
tw-
Oscar.
20 20 years 20 years later for you, 30 for me.
400 for you. No.
It, yeah. But what I want to say is that it actually continues, right? There's so
Yeah.
many few things that I used to do when I was a teenager that I still do. And one of
Yeah.
those is like reading and writing fantasy. Like, even
Yeah.
though it's not like I'm writing, like, I'm not like Brandon Sanderson. I'm not publishing like a book every year, like
Yeah.
fantasy book every year, but I do write a lot of fantasy.
You
It's
do?
only sometimes it's just for me, sometimes it's for my campaign world. Whatever I do, I just write it, and then you do the same. And I love what you said about like writing fan fiction as a kid, because
Yeah.
if you had those, that would be amazing.
Oh, I actually do still have some of my fan fiction stories. I'm not gonna lie. I have this binder.
Oh.
I mean, I'm not gonna show you. It's behind me, but I'm not gonna show you. And it's some of those like really old dot matrix printer. You'd have to like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
line the pin, it would all be attached. Yes. And I would type it on like my mom's. I think it was a Macintosh. It wasn't an Apple computer, it was a
Right.
Macintosh. And I was like typing
Yes.
away. Bah, 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 bah. Some of it's handwritten
That's
with
amazing.
pencil. Yeah, yeah. I have some of it. Most of it, I think it's like this just, at that time in your life, you just, I don't know, it's like shame just comes over you and everything you do, you feel like you're like, oh, that's stupid. So I would actually rip up all my stories and I would shove them down the bathroom drain because I was so
Hmm.
embarrassed of my
Right.
stupid fan fiction. So I'm glad I kept some of it, but now it's
Yeah.
like spread it out into the world. Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, as a teenager, that happens. Not,
Ugh,
it's to everybody, right? Like
so
we
rough.
want to fit. We want to fit
Yeah,
in a mold. We want to be the same as everybody. We
yeah,
grow up, and it's like, I don't want to be the same. I want to be unique. And then you start like getting all those things. But
yeah,
yeah, no, it's
yeah.
it's pretty cool. It's really interesting to learn how, like, both you and I, like, why we started reading, why we started writing, and why fantasy is so important for both of us.
Yeah. Why is fantasy so important for you now? I'm curious.
I think it's kind of the same. Like, I love worlds that are not ours,
Yeah.
and like just imagining those things, like how, I don't know, how a world was created. Like, if gods like existed, and there were like in like there were manifestations of the gods in a world,
Mhm.
what would that happen? Like, all that speculation. Like, if magic was a thing, like if I could cast a fireball, what would the world look like? Because it wouldn't be just Oscar, like, recording a podcast and casting fireball out of, like, just that doesn't make any
Yeah.
sense, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah.
every little thing that happens in a fantasy world has an impact on another part of the world.
Yeah.
And I love to learn all those things.
This is why you're a world builder, and we do have an episode this season coming up on world building, and this is Oscar's moment to shine because he is an epic world builder.
I think one of the things that we wanted to talk today as well was how all those magical worlds can help us understand the real world. Just because there's an evil empire with mages and wizards and dragons doesn't mean that we cannot have an evil empire with, well, maybe it's not wizards, but it's people who hold a lot of power, and
Yeah.
maybe their magic is different. The magic that we have in our world is, of course, not magic, but they do have power. They can make
Yeah.
decisions that impact everyone else. So I think those things are cool, and I want to hear your take on why fantasy allows us to understand complex worlds.
Yeah, actually, and not to plug myself, but I have a book coming out that is all about this. The Monster in the Mirror is going to be published spring of 2024 with ECW Press. And in it, I talk about specifically about mental illness, abnormal behaviors, and othering, but how that has been perceived and constructed through the fantasy genre. And I also use a little bit of fantastical horror in there too, as we will be talking about in this podcast. So basically, speculative fiction. But I think with fantasy, a guy Gabriel Kay, who is the amazing Canadian fantasy author, he wrote an essay for the Globe and Mail and it was published in 1999. But you can actually find it on his website. It's called Bright Weavings, it's his website. And in the essay, he actually argues that fantasy gives us a way to understand that which is uncomfortable to unpack or dissect or wrap our heads around about our own world. Fantasy puts it into a medium that is more digestible for us. So, if we take, in my case, why do we use a madness trope a lot in our villains? This was just one aspect of it, but in our villains in fantasy, you think of the mad scientist trope, you think of Dr. Frankenstein, and
Yeah.
what makes a monster. So, being able to wrap this in a fantastical casing, I guess, you actually, it's more inviting to the reader and it helps them open their minds and understanding more than, say, um, just, genre fiction, like just regular fiction or drama or whatever, because that's like in the regular fiction, this is the world that we already know. We know these stories. We know the mental
Hmm.
illness story. We know, and it sometimes it even borders into trauma porn. So, when I was researching for my book, it was actually D&D. I was researching or TTRPGs as well, and there was a slew of folks who actually approached me because they had used to be able to explore gender identity. One individual used it to explore queerness, her brown identity,
Mm.
trauma, and another individual, he said that D&D actually helped him realize, helped him come out as a trans man, right? And this was
Hmm.
in the 90s when, I mean, even
Yeah.
today, exploring your gender in a public way, it can be very dangerous. Fantasy helps us understand or be able to explore these things that really feel uncomfortable, in a way that
Hmm.
nothing else. Like, I really don't think there's a lot, unless you go to therapy once or twice a week. Fantasy is
So
therapy.
basically, what we're saying is that fantasy is cheap therapy.
Yeah,
Cheap in the
totally.
sense that you need to spend that much money, not that
Totally.
it's bad. Yeah.
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 No, it should be a part of your treatment plan. Your healthcare provider should be like, "Okay, here's medication, here's therapy, and
Mhm.
here's fantasy."
And here's a book.
And
Yeah.
here's a
Yeah.
book.
Yeah.
Or
And you
here's
can be like, there's a Dragonlance book or something like that.
um, I think that you might have already answered this question, but, like, the same question back to you is what does fantasy mean to you? What does it do for you now?
Right now,
Yeah.
no, it's kind of like the idea of, I mean, besides the like, kind of like reading and getting ideas of other worlds, it's also a way to escape the world. Like, you wake
Yeah.
up, you read the news. Well,
Yeah.
maybe not everybody, but that's what I do. It's kind of like my routine. Like, I wake up, I read the news. There's war here. There's another problem here. There's crime over there. A recession. Blah blah blah.
Yeah.
Like, you get all these things that are can be pretty depressing, and then you go to work, and then your mind is focused on being productive. Like, this idea that we have, and like this, I mean, in the world, like, the idea of being productive is like doing
Mhm.
your job properly, like getting results, making your numbers look good, all those things. And then by the time you're done, it's 5 6 in the evening. You get home and you get home to your family, and you might be in a shitty mood.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends on your
Might.
job, depends on your day, but it's possible. So one of the things that I like to do is like kind of like as I'm winding down, and just trying to do things that kind of like give me energy. One of those
Mhm.
things is reading, and reading fantasy, because I get so obsessed with this. I love lore. Like lore is my thing. That, like KJ was saying, like the next episode's
Yeah.
about world building, and you're gonna you're gonna realize how much I love
Yeah.
lore and all the things that happen in the world. So that gives me a lot of energy. It gives me enough energy to have like an amazing evening, a peaceful night, and to wake up the next day to read that the war that I read the day before is still going and it's not
Yeah.
ending. Like, I think that's kind of
Yeah.
what fantasy means to me at this point in my life.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely that escape. I mean, fantasy, there's always an escapist element to fantasy, but I'm super curious now because you and I lead very different lives. Like, I work from home. I'm actually a writer, professionally a writer. So my day is just kind of like does not have a lot of structure because I don't know actually how to have structure in my life. So, but you work a corporate job. You know,
Yeah.
got have to be at your desk by 8 a.m. or whatever the case may be. And sometimes your days don't end until 7 p.m. And you fantasy helps you through that. So I love that dichotomy between our lives as well, but we still come to the same conclusion about fantasy. But I'm also curious
Yeah.
about other aspects in our life. Like, is your partner into fantasy at all? Because mine is not. Like,
I
at
think
all.
mine likes fantasy, but not as much as I do.
Yeah.
But like she loved the, like for example, all the Harry Potter books. She
Right.
loved them, and actually she was the one who introduced me to those books, because when they came out, I was like a little bit snobbish. It was like, no, those are, it's fantasy for kids. I don't read that. I read like fantasy for adults. And it was when book three came out that we met, and she's like, I'm reading this book, and it's amazing. And of course, we started dating. I wanted to talk to her about something, so it's like, okay, fine, I'll read them. And and again, like that's, you got another type of world, another type of magic, blah blah blah. And I actually love the world that was created there. And
Yeah.
but she's not like you wouldn't see her every day reading fantasy. That's not her
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah, that's not my partner either. Like, the only fantasy that he'll ever get into again and again and again is Alien, the Alien series. He
Those are amazing.
like, I mean, I've seen them so many times. They're not my jam, but I can definitely appreciate it. Um, that and DC, like, Superman, The Flash.
Superhero,
The Flash is
right?
his thing, so he's been watching The Flash, like, all apparently the 10th season and the last season is coming out, and he's just, like, on the couch watching them all because he hasn't watched them all before every year. And Alien, that's it, though. He's not a reader. He's, like, not into the fantasy stuff like I am, but I it's somehow it works. It works.
But I think one of the things that you're mentioning here, and I think it's pretty interesting, and it's something that we should kind of like let the people who are listening know, that
Yeah.
like fantasy is not only reading. Like, yeah, we
Yeah.
can be like, there's a lot of books and there's a lot of things, and we love them and we read them, that's fine. But fantasy comes in so many different ways.
Yes.
Like, could be a movie, could be a TV show, could be a comic book,
Yeah.
could be a video game. Like,
Yeah.
there's so many places, like TTRPG, as you
Cosplay,
can see in my
LARPing, all of
background.
it. Yeah, yeah.
All those things
Mhm.
are fantasy related. That
Yeah.
someone who says like, you know what, I don't like fantasy, but I love playing, I don't know, World of Warcraft,
Right.
right? There's so much story, so much lore in that world that it honestly is considered fantasy, right? So
Absolutely. Yeah.
again, I think it's one of the things that we're going to focus on books because we love reading and writing.
Yeah.
But I think at some point we're going to talk also about other
Oh, yeah.
media that
Absolutely.
that talks about fantasy. Perfect. So I think it's time to wrap up, and I think why don't we give like a quick teaser of our next episode? It's going to be about world building.
Yeah, so basically our next episode is gonna be super exciting. Oscar is gonna be diving into what he is so good at, and it is world building, and it's all the aspects about building a world.
A super high level approach to world building. I
Yes.
mean, there's so many things in building a world, like magic, gods,
Mm,
history, society, politics, um, It's like even like biology, like everything that's
Yeah.
happening there.
Yep.
So in this episode is going to be more like a super high level, like a 10,000 feet approach
Yeah.
to the world building. We can
Yeah.
fit it in one episode, but that's kind of the idea.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack with world building, definitely, and Oscar is the person to go to about that. But world building is also one of the toughest things to get started. If you're a writer, how do you where do you position yourself in this world? How do you do it? Oscar's got it. Stay tuned for the next week's episode. It's going to be awesome. I'll probably have to cut him off at some point. Yes.
Well, this is the end of the episode. I hope you enjoyed it. You already know what are we going to be talking about next week. So
Yes.
yeah, hope you tune in.
Thank you and happy writing.